The war ended when Robert E. Lee, a Confederate general, surrendered at Appomattox House to Ulysses S. Grant, which diminished all hopes of a Confederate win. The death total of the Civil War was the most in American history, having approximately 698,000 deaths. The amount of people wounded was around 476,000 people. This is an example of how violent this war actually was. 6 days after the war ended, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in a theater. This devastating event and the Union's victory led to a Reconstruction era in the United States. The Reconstruction era was an attempt to rebuild the United States in all sorts of facets, specifically the amendments, Jim Crow laws, the KKK, economic reconstruction, and the strengthening of our government.
In the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, African Americans were integrated into American society as citizens. Thus, they had to make special rights to make sure that slavery would never again be a thing in America. This created the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed. This amendment states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall never been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery. The only time involuntary servitude can exist in the United States is as punishment for a crime. An example of this is getting sentenced to community service hours as punishment. In 1868, 3 years after the 13th Amendment was ratified, the 14th Amendment was passed. This amendment granted citizenship and equal civil and legal rights to African Americans and slaves who had been emancipated after the American Civil War. It guarantees equal protection under the law. It makes sure that no state can take away a person's liberty or justice. In 1870, 2 years after the 14th and 5 years after the 13th Amendments were ratified, the 15th Amendment was passed. This amendment guarantees the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment made it illegal to take away a citizen's right to vote based on their ethnicity. Even with all these rights being added to the Constitution, people still found ways to create laws that were constitutional, but separated colored people from white people. These laws were called Jim Crow laws.
The term Jim Crow originated in the early 19th century during the era of minstrel shows, a form of entertainment that blended music and comedy. These performances often included satirical skits that poked fun at societal issues of the time. One recurring character in these skits was Jim Crow, a comical and physically impaired African slave. His portrayal became so popular that his name eventually became associated with the laws that enforced racial segregation in the United States. The roots of Jim Crow laws can be traced back to 1865, shortly after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. In response, Southern states enacted black codes, a set of oppressive laws that restricted the rights of formerly enslaved people. These codes dictated where black people could work, the wages they could earn, and even control their movement. They were designed to keep black Americans in the system of forced labor, stripping them of voting rights, controlling where they lived, and even seizing their children for labor. The legal system was rigged against black citizens, with many former Confederate soldiers holding positions as police officers and judges. This made it incredibly difficult for African Americans to win legal cases and ensured they were constantly subjected to the harsh black codes. In addition to these laws, the black codes worked alongside a brutal prison labor system where incarcerated individuals, particularly black prisoners, were treated as though they were still enslaved. Black offenders often received disproportionately long sentences compared to their white counterparts. The grueling work conditions were so severe that many prisoners did not survive to complete their sentences.
During the Reconstruction era, local governments, as well as the Democratic Party and President Andrew Johnson, stopped attempts to progress the lives of black Americans in the country. Violence against African Americans was on the rise, especially with things dividing the country like segregation, hate, and fear. While the Jim Crow era was a spark for the creation of many violent and hateful groups against African Americans, the one that stood out the most was the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK. Originally started in 1865 as a private club for Confederate veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee, The KKK soon grew into a secret society that would evoke violence on innocent African Americans. These terrible acts included things like torture, arson, hangings, and beatings. Members of the KKK ranged from the lowest people barely getting by in society to high-level government officials. Although less prominent, the KKK still remains today and is a dark spot in our country's history and present society.
The Civil War, like all wars, had a significant impact on the people by destroying lives and property. This was especially true in the Confederacy. From 1861 onwards, the Confederate government struggled to find the guns, food, and supplies needed to build an army. To pay their troops and keep their economy alive, the Confederate Congress turned to printing paper money, which quickly sank in value and led to rapid inflation. In many cases, Confederate officials eliminated the requirement for taxes to be paid in cash and instead took the food and materials needed from their citizens. Even with the vast agriculture of the South, many Southerners struggled to find enough to eat.
After 1867, an increasing number of Southern whites turned to violence in response to revolutionary changes of radical Reconstruction. The KKK, also known as the Ku Klux Klan, and other white supremacist organizations targeted local Republican leaders, white and black, and other Africans who challenged white authority. Even though the federal legislation passed during the presidency of President Ulysses S. Grant in 1871 took aim at the Ku Klux Klan and others who attempted to interfere with black suffrage and other political rights. White supremacy gradually took control of the South again after the early 1870s as support for Reconstruction slowly disappeared. Racism was still a strong force in both the North and the South, and the Republicans became more conservative and less egalitarian as the decade continued. In 1874, after an economic depression brought much of the South into poverty, the Democratic Party won control of the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War. After the war ended, the federal government decided to unify and take control over the states with a more rigorous attitude. This attitude came from the government controlling the Union and winning, which solidified the authority of the government. The federal government of the United States wants to establish a more centralized system. An example of the government asserting its power is when they put the Reconstruction Acts into place. The Reconstruction Acts were implemented in 1867 and divided the South into military districts. The federal powers expanded by being able to tax directly, forcibly make people join the military/draft, and make a national banking system that would be stable. In the modern day, people still use the amendments put into place. People still fight against racism and its effects on others, and people learned from their mistakes during the war to never make these mistakes again in the future. Thank you for listening to our presentation.